I'm currently a professional development leader at the National Science Learning Centre in York, and I do science CPD for teachers or anybody that's involved in science education, and we do early years to post-16, so we cover everything. This isn't a science-specific session, however, so don't worry about that. That's okay. What I'm going to do today is a speed introduction to action research, and I'm hoping that's what you think. I was a bit slack with sending my workshop description in, so you only have the title because I sent my blurb too late. Is that what everybody is coming for? Cool. So it's really interesting thinking about action research. Would anybody care to say what they know about action research already? Anybody? Or are you coming to this from a blank slate, or do you know a little bit? So if you know lots, do you want to put your thumb up if you're kind of not sure, or you know a bit, or you're not?
I've just heard of it to do with like the girls in physics.
Okay, so not heard.
Sort of trying things out in practice.
Yeah.
Really.
Okay, so something I have learning outcomes because I have to have learning outcomes. So this is a real speed session. I actually run action research courses anywhere from a day to 3 days. So to do it in 45 minutes is quite thing. But hopefully it'll give you a taster. And I've got links at the end of my PowerPoint. If you want to leave me your email address, you can have all the materials, and then you can follow it up. So it's really a taster so that you think, oh, I'd quite like to try that, or we might have that. And it is, I'm quite pleased because, name was gone, Daniel from a school in Birmingham was at my session at Research Ed, which I did similar to this. And his whole school is now doing action research, and his session today is on using action research in school. So hopefully it's enough of a taster that if you want to go and run with it, it'll work. So the first thing to say, and this is what action research isn't. It's not a randomised controlled trial. It's not about finding out necessarily what works across a wide, broad range. We're very keen on randomised controlled trials at the moment, and they have their place in education, but so does action research. So it's not like a science, and for scientists, this idea of randomised controlled trial and fair testing is something that we grow up with. And often I find that science teachers struggle with action research because they can't control all variables. And that's the big problem with any educational research, is you can't control all the variables, which is a challenge. It's not intended to prove things necessarily. There isn't necessarily a right or wrong answer to your action research. To be fair, in most research there's not a right or wrong answer, but you usually set out with a hypothesis to test. It's not always objective. It is a type of research where you are part of the experiment, and so it can't be objective because you are within the experiment. It's that whole variable thing again, you are part of it. But it isn't research that's done to you. It's not that your head teacher has signed up for a control trial and this is what you're going to do. It's something that teachers need to decide to do for themselves. That's not to say that whole schools can't choose to use action research as a CPD model, and I've worked with a number of schools that have got action research as a CPD model, and all teachers have 2 hours every half term to carry out their action research, which runs over 6 months or 18 months, depending on which school. So head teachers can say, this is how we're going to do our CPD, you will do action research. And what you find is that in a school, some of the people go, oh, this is fab, and you have wonderful action research, and other people go, what? And they do their bare 2 hours, and they come up with something that their year 11s would be embarrassed to produce. So it isn't, to do it well, it's not something that can be imposed upon you, even though head teachers do that. And it's not a new idea. It's been around, well, certainly within the medical profession and health studies from about 19 1970s. I found references to it in the 1940s. So it's not something shiny and new, but it goes in waves, and different areas of subjects choose, suddenly find it and then it goes again. And I think it's currently kind of on the crest of a wave at the minute in education. So what is it? Is my definition. And it's basically you noticing things in your classroom, changing something, and having a look at what effect that change has, and then seeing whether that's going to change your practice in the longer term. So it's a reflective practice. So anybody that's done a PGC or teacher training in the last 10 years, where you have to do the whole module on reflective practitioners, and it's very much the sort of thing that you do in that. It's about thinking about your own practice. It's partly taking a step back. Fabulous, thank you. Taking a step back and thinking about your own practice and developing an area of your practice, rather than creating new knowledge that you can then go and share with the world. So this is a fantastic book by John Mason called The Discipline of Noticing, or Researching Your Own Practice, The Discipline of Noticing. And one of the things that he says in the very start of the book is that professional development is about becoming an expert. It's about getting better at doing what you do. And changing, there's the thing that I'm sure David would say, and I have heard him say that, in the first 2 years teachers get better, and then they often plateau, and they don't carry on getting better. Action research is to help you beyond that plateau. The first 2 years, you're running to cope, you develop lots of habits and things that you do. Action research is then helping you to take a step back and say, okay, why do I have that particular classroom habit or classroom structure? Is it a good one? Is it one that I put in the first 3 weeks of my NQT term because it was all I could manage, and now it's worked okay and I've kept it? And so action research is to sort of take that step back, to notice things that are going on in your classroom, to think, oh, that unit didn't go so well this year. What is it about my students that made that unit not go so well? Because last year it went really well. What happens next year if I do it slightly differently? And it's that kind of thing which I think all good teachers do, is that reflection. But quite often we're so busy that we don't have time to sort of do that careful thinking over a broad space. So definitely that book is really worth reading. So what, as a very broad idea, what does action research, once you've noticed something, once you've thought of something that you think, oh, that's interesting, or oh, I'd like to maybe dig into that bit deeper, you have to decide the research question, and that's probably the hardest bit of the action research, is getting a good research question. And that's whatever kind of research you do. If you're doing, I have a colleague who's doing a part-time PhD, so it's taking her 6 years. It's taken her 2.5 years to get a question right. So coming up with an action research question, which we're going to do at the end of the session, 5 minutes isn't enough. It's taken her 2.5 years, and getting a good question is important. You then sort of think about planning the action research. Okay, what happens now? What am I going to change? How am I going to know that we've changed? Then you do the action research. You analyse and reflect on it. And then you share the learning, maybe with colleagues, or you might share it with classes actually sometimes. And then you plan it again. It's this whole idea, I've done that as a circle, it really ought to be this spiral thing, because it never stops. You never get to the end of it, because you try something out, you learn from that, and then you try something else out. So it's it's not a circle, it's a spiral that keeps going. And at at any point you can step off and say, okay, that's enough, or you can step back on. So the first thing I want to think of is what makes a good question. So I've got a selection of questions. If you're not sitting next to somebody that you could talk to, if you would like to shuggle so that you can talk to somebody, that would be really good. There you go. Yep, you feel free to. So what I've got here are examples of questions that people have come up with in their first draft of planning action research. So there's 12 questions there. We don't need to sort of look at all of them, but just as a discussion, these are not necessarily good questions for action research. What I'd like you to think about is have a look at those and think about, well, what would good criteria for an action research question be? So have a look at this question and think, well, can I measure anything? Is it something that I can actually, what could I do to explore that question? And if there isn't something you can think about doing to explore that question, then what would make it a good question? So I'll give you 5 minutes or so to have that sort of discussion.
Oh, sorry, just yeah.
Yeah.
Word-wise.
Also, I mean, that one is really natural. I don't know, if you're at home, take a football,
Just need something that's more specific.
yeah. Otherwise, you're never going to be hard to check. Because that one's kind of useful, isn't it?